Welcome to the Fact Hunter channel. In today's episode about World War II, we will try to answer the question if Japan performed a test attack before attacking Pearl Harbor. General test before Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Okuyama flew at the head of a bomber squadron of the Japanese Imperial Japanese Navy over the broad current of China's Yangtze River. The Chinese call it the Changjiang, or Long River, because it rolls its waters from the depths of the country along a channel nearly 6,000 kilometers long before it flows into the Yellow Sea. Some of the great cities that have sprung up on the banks of the Yangtze include Shanghai and Nanjing. It was the morning of December 12, 1937. Lieutenant Okuyama and the pilots from his squadron flew over the fertile Yangtze River Valley, keeping a watchful eye on the ships passing beneath them, the USS Panay, a 450-ton gunboat headed downriver. Built in Shanghai specifically to patrol China's rivers, the Panay was to guard American sailors against the bands of bloodthirsty pirates that swarmed these waters. The commander of the Panay was Lieutenant Commander James J. Hughes, a Naval Academy graduate who had held the post since last year. His gunboat measured nearly 60 meters from bow to stern, and its armament consisted of a battery of two 3-inch guns, a battery of 50mm caliber anti-aircraft machine guns, and standard 30mm caliber machine guns used against pirates attacking at close range. Two narrow funnels and canvas-covered bulwarks indicated that the Panay was intended for shallow water navigation, and the large American flags, flying at the bow and stern, were visible from a distance even to an observer with very poor eyesight. Panay, whose crew consisted of 55 sailors, was sailing on a humanitarian mission, carrying 4 American embassy employees, 5 refugees, and a cluster of Western journalists from Nanjing, which is under siege by the Japanese army. Just before noon, Commander Hughes' gunboat had already covered 30 miles. Her commander established communication with Shanghai, giving his position and reporting that he intended to drop anchor. The cruel war that had been going on in China for several months began on the hot night of July 1, 1937. That's when a memorable incident occurred near Beijing's historic Marco Polo Bridge. A unit of the Kwantu Army, which had been ordered by the generals in control of the Japanese government to guard their interests in the city, fired on a nearby garrison of the Chinese National Army of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. This was, somewhat too nervously, a reaction to the alleged escape of a soldier from that garrison. As it was later determined, the Chinese soldier had gone out to relieve himself. Upon seeing him, however, shots were fired, and an exchange of fire soon began. Taking advantage of this pretext, unprovoked aggression against Imperial Japan, Japanese generals sent new divisions, tanks and aircraft to China, and the conflict heated up with full force. Japan was put on full alert. The Alcock government-issued pamphlets exhorted civilians and the military to self-sacrifice in an incipient crusade to liberate Asia and the Western Pacific from imperialism. In reality, this liberation crusade had begun 10 years earlier. In 1927, Japanese generals and admirals ruled that armed conflict with the United States was inevitable, so they drew up a top-secret plan, dubbed the Tanaka Memorandum, a scenario for the military conquest of China and further expansion in Asia and war with the United States. Now, in 1937, on the Yangtze River near Nanjing, everyone aboard the gunboat Panay was eating lunch unhurriedly when they were roused to their feet at 1:30 p.m. by the cry of senior signalman Lang, "The Japs are dropping bombs!" A squadron of Lieutenant Okuyama's squadron, which included, according to later conflicting accounts, between 8 and 15 aircraft, fell on the anchored Panay with a roar of engines. Commander Jim Hughes ran toward the wheelhouse, which was torn apart by an explosion moments later. The commander emerged from it with a broken leg. On deck, Norman Alley of Universal News grabbed a camera and began filming. The planes were flying so low that he could easily distinguish the faces of the pilots. Alley was shocked to see that the Panay was still being bombed, although the pilots could no doubt clearly see the huge American flags flying in the breeze at the bow and stern. At the same time, the crew members of the Panay caught up to the machine guns and opened fire on the diving Japanese aircraft. Jim Marshall, Far East correspondent for Collier magazine, watched the scene in amazement. The attackers were so low that they could not have been unaware that they were bombing an American ship. A moment later, Marshall was seriously wounded by bomb fragments that stabbed him in the neck, shoulder, stomach and chest. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Arthur F. Anders, the operations officer, took command in place of the severely wounded Commander Jim Hughes. Anders, a native of Vallejo, California, had just conducted ineffective machine gun fire toward the diving Japanese aircraft when he was wounded in the larynx and fell to the deck. 20 minutes after the first explosion, the Panay, perforated like a sieve by machine gun shells and bomb fragments, began to sink. Stretched out on deck, Anders, who was bleeding profusely and unable to speak due to a throat wound, pulled out a piece of white chalk and wrote on the bulkhead, "Get into the lifeboats, stay as close to shore as possible, then send the lifeboats back." Crew members and passengers crowded alongside, lowered their lifeboats and rowed toward shore. Some jumped off the deck and began to swim across. Suddenly they heard the terrifying sound of Japanese planes diving again, followed immediately by the furious whiz of machine gun shells hitting the water around them. Barely had the survivors managed to hide in the reeds overgrowing the shore, a Japanese speedboat appeared and opened fire on them with machine guns. The speedboat then turned around and fired at the sinking Panay. However, before the gunboat went down, the speedboat approached her, and several Japanese officers boarded her, presumably in search of secret ciphers or modern equipment. The survivors' odyssey didn't end until several days later, when, after a strenuous march inland, they finally reached an area occupied by the Chinese army. Throughout this time, troops of Japanese soldiers scoured the area to track them down. By the time the castaways from the Panay reached safety, the losses suffered could be estimated. 2 American sailors and an Italian journalist, Sandro Sandini, were killed. 17 crew members and American embassy employees were injured, some of them seriously. Meanwhile, the day after the sinking of the Panay, Japanese General Iwan Matsui, a short man with horn-rimmed glasses, led his victorious troops into Nanjing, treading on the heels of Chiang Kai-shek's retreating troops. Matsui, who rode a horse with a symbolically white coat for the occasion, proclaimed that the Japanese Imperial Road shines brightly. Japanese soldiers staged a bloodbath in Nanjing, the likes of which had not been seen since the days of the barbaric Hun Attila. Some 250,000 Chinese civilians, men, women and children were murdered, beheaded with samurai swords or stabbed with bayonets. The massacre became known as the Nanjing Rape. Even hardy German army observers were shocked by what they described as a systematic slaughter in reports sent to Berlin. When news of the fate of the Panay reached the United States, angry shouts of outrage were raised. The usually subdued Cordell Hull, the gray-haired suave Secretary of State, called the sinking of the gunboat the work of disheveled, half-mad Japanese admirals and generals. The fury of the Americans increased a few days later when Colonel Kinjiro Hashimoto, the highest Japanese officer in the region who sincerely hated the United States, made the comment, quoted immediately by the press, "I received an order to open fire on Panay." At the White House, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt watched carefully the film, shot from the deck of the Panay, by Universal News correspondent Norman Alley. Before the footage was released to U.S. theaters, Roosevelt, under his presidential powers, ordered it to be censored and close-ups of the Japanese pilots' faces cut out. Displaying the film truncated in this way was intended to quell public anger and prevent an open confrontation with the powerful Japanese war machine. Was the attack on the Panay really the result of a mistake? Or was it planned as a sort of dress rehearsal before the surprise raid on Pearl Harbor, carried out just 4 years later? With their treacherous move, did the Japanese Supreme Commanders want to gauge the will and resolve of the Americans? In their official statements, the Japanese spoke of a tragic case of misrecognition. However, many U.S. senior military officials privately expressed the view that the attack was a planned, precisely orchestrated operation, a combined endeavor involving dive bombers, a heavily armed motorcade and ground army troops. Perhaps Japanese commanders had many doubts, which only the attack on Panay could dispel. How harsh or weak would the official U.S. response be to the deaths of soldiers and destruction of equipment? How strong and well-trained was the U.S. military organization? Several thousand U.S. Marines were stationed in nearby Shanghai. Would they rush to the site of the sinking of the Panay to thwart further expected hostile acts? The Roosevelt government did not want to be drawn into a direct confrontation in the Far East. Therefore, having previously expressed appropriate indignation publicly, it issued an official protest to the Japanese government, which was kept in an overly mild tone. It accused Japanese pilots of recklessness during flights. Presumably to conceal its future intentions toward the United States, the Japanese government apologized for the Yangtze River incident and handed over a check for more than $2 million as reparations. The crucial question remains, however, were Japanese commanders-in-chief so flummoxed by the insipid American response to the unprovoked attack on the Panay that they regarded the United States as a paper tiger and continued to float plans for a surprise strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor?